Hello. If you've clicked on this video, I assume it's because you're interested in learning about linguistics. Well, before I can explain linguistics in a meaningful way, we need to first talk about some really basic terms and concepts. So we'll do that today. Hi, Professor Kent Lee here. Welcome to my video. Well, what is linguistics? It's the study of language and languages. Okay, but what does that mean? Well, we need to unpack that first, and we need to talk about some basic terms. We need to talk about, we probably need to briefly define some different areas of linguistics that I'll mention along the way, but then we need to define key terms. What is a language? What is language? These are actually not easy, and linguists spend a lot of time talking about these. Then we need to talk about what is grammar? Because as a linguist, we have a really different understanding of that. And along with that, what are rules? And then we'll, maybe in the next video, get more into what linguistics is and its background. So first, just a brief overview, some basic vocabulary. I'll talk about sometimes some of these different areas of linguistics. I'll explain more, though, in future videos about what these are. First is phonetics, the sounds of language, and then phonology is how they're organized into some meaningful sound systems of language. And that may not be clear, but we'll get to that later. There's syntax, which is your sentence level grammar, how sentences and phrases are organized, and morphology, and that's organization within words. How words are formed, like morphology, which is two Greek words meaning form and study of, as well as grammatical endings, grammatical forms. So like in English, we put an S or some form of that sound at the end of words to indicate plurals, and ed to indicate past tense, and that's morphology. And phonology, syntax, and morphology go together in a special way, as we'll see later. There's also semantics, which is word meanings, and then pragmatics, which is how meanings arise from the context. So it's one thing to say thirsty, but if I'm at your house and I say, gee, I'm thirsty, you respond by saying, oh, would you like some water? Because I'm not just commenting on the feelings of my vocal apparatus, but I'm making an indirect request or something. That's pragmatics, communication in context. Language acquisition, language learning, and applied linguistics, which deals with the teaching and learning of languages. That's actually a big field nowadays. There's sociolinguistics, which is the social aspect of language, and some of that goes back to anthropological linguistics, the anthropological study of different people groups and their languages. Psycholinguistics, which is how the mind processes language, which is actually quite complicated, and that's also a big thing now. Along with that, neurolinguistics, what happens at the brain level, the neuron level, and such. Historical comparative linguistics, how languages are related to each other historically in their development. Computational linguistics, computers and linguistics, and how to teach machines to talk to you. But more on all of this later. Basic question, though, for you. What is a language? How do you define a language, like French and German and English and Japanese and Korean and Chinese? What is a language? It's actually not that easy. What are the criteria for distinguishing one language from another? You might think, well, they can understand each other. Well, imagine somebody from Texas going to Scotland, to maybe Glasgow. Would they understand the Glasgow dialect? Or would they understand the Texan? They would have some difficulties. Those are different dialects of English. Well, what is a dialect? What is the standard? What is a dialect versus a language? And that itself is a little tricky. But then, you know, let's look at some dialects that seem related to each other, but they're divided differently into separate languages. let's look at the case of German. In Germany, you have the standard German, or Hochdeutsch, which is taught in the schools, and most people with some degree of education speak Hochdeutsch, or at least read it. Go down to Switzerland, about 3/4 of people there speak German, they say, and they identify nationally as Swiss, but they identify linguistically as German speaking. But their German is very different from what's spoken in Germany. And a lot of Germans would have trouble understanding Swiss German. It's very different. The Schweizerdeutsch, as the Swiss call it. It's very different. Then there are other dialects in Germany, many other dialects that would be hard to understand, especially if you only know Hochdeutsch, as I do. Go up to the northern Germany, and there are groups of dialects we call Plattdeutsch, or Platt. Platt means low because it's the lowlands. And you go towards northwest Germany, toward the border with Holland, and there are some Platt dialects that are really similar to the Dutch dialects across the border in Holland. So imagine somebody from a little town in northwestern Germany like Lingen or Ems going across the border to some little town in Holland like Almelo, and they can communicate if they speak the local dialects. Get into Amsterdam, and by that time you've got a different language that's called Dutch. Although Dutch is not drastically different from German compared to the Swiss German. I can maybe read a Dutch newspaper and understand about 2/3 of it at least, although I've never studied Dutch. But they don't consider it German. The Dutch say, no, we're not German, we are Dutch. They have their own history and identity, and that's a factor here. Then you go into northern Belgium, and there's something called Flemish, which some consider a separate language, but it is really a set of dialects that are very similar to Dutch. It is essentially a variety of Dutch, but they are sometimes considered a separate language. Likewise, Luxembourgish, which is like sort of a Dutch Flemish German dialect with some French mixed in. Those are often considered separate languages. Why? We often think mutual intelligibility defines a language, and many times, yes. Sweden and English are not mutually intelligible. Those are different languages. Dutch and Norwegian and Korean and Japanese, those are all different languages. They're not mutually intelligible. But with Germany, you've got this continuum from Swiss German through Germany to Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg. It's more of a continuum. And so because people's identities are really bound with their language and culture, we often follow fairly arbitrary political, cultural divisions and saying this is a language. Dutch is a separate language. Swiss German is not a separate language. It's a dialect group that is a variety of German dialects, even though they're very different from the dialects in Germany. A similar situation exists, for example, with Spanish and Portuguese in the set of dialects in between along the border called Galician. Spanish, Galician, Portuguese. It's kind of a continuum. We make this arbitrary division between Spanish and Portuguese. Look at the languages of the former Yugoslavia. Bosnian, Serbian, Montenegrin, Slovenian, and Croatian. Those are now considered separate languages, even though they are largely mutually intelligible. But because of important political, social identities involved, they identify as separate languages. Serbian, or we are Slovenian, we are Bosnian, and so they identify as separate languages. So the issue of language identity is really complicated. And then look at Chinese. You've got the Mandarin, which is, or Guoyu or Putonghua, which is based on the Beijing dialect largely, and related dialects in the north. Those are not mutually intelligible with other varieties of Chinese dialects. You've got in the south, like Hong Kong, Macau, and the nearby provinces of Guangdong, Guangzhou, the Yue or Cantonese dialects. In the Shanghai area and nearby provinces, you've got what's called Wu, and that's not mutually intelligible with Mandarin. Cantonese certainly is not mutually intelligible with Northern Chinese at all. Then you've got the Hakka people group, which is kind of spread in various places. Then toward the southeast, in the province of Fujian, and in Taiwan, you've got a language that's variously called Fujian, or Minnan, or Southern Min, or Taiyu. And it's not mutually intelligible. It's not mutually intelligible with Mandarin. Linguists actually consider these separate languages, about 5 separate languages. To most people who don't know much about Chinese, they think of it all as Chinese, and it's not. But there's not such a strong cultural, political identity with Wu or Hakka or whatever. They are all culturally Chinese, but linguistically they are separate languages. But in real life, are these separate languages? Depends on who you ask, depends on which linguist you ask, or which sociologist or demographer you ask. It's not easy. When we talk about dialects of a language, that's also complicated, as we'll see. To a large degree, different dialects of English are mutually intelligible, but you get differences, and you look, if you, for example, put an Australian speaker from Perth in a room with a Texas speaker and a Scottish speaker and an Irish, and they can have communication problems. Which one is standard English? Depends on who you ask. In North America, we have standard North American English, and in England, they have standard British, and there's standard Australian. There's also Irish and South African and New Zealand English and Scottish English and so on. Which is correct? None are necessarily correct. To say one is correct is kind of gets judgmental and elitist, and you're saying, really, there's only one proper way to speak, and if you don't speak it, then you're wrong, or you're less educated. What is standard American English or North American? Where is it spoken? Not necessarily anywhere, particularly, although it tends to correspond with educated urban Midwestern English, the kind of English that's spoken by people in big cities in the Midwest, like Chicago, in my dialect. Although I grew up in Texas with a mild Texas dialect, but I kind of lost it as I adapted a general American accent. Who made this? Well, it's actually more of a media creation. If you watch like old movies and TV shows from a couple of generations ago, it sounds more like East Coast English, but it has shifted more towards Midwestern kind of American English. And that's kind of the basis of this media English or standard North American English. It's more of a media creation. It's created for the entertainment industry and news broadcasters so they can be understood easily by most people and most people can relate to them and not be seen as elitist. With British English, standard British English is kind of, well, based variously on BBC English, often called BBC English. Received pronunciation, because it's kind of received from the Queen's English. Oxford and Cambridge, kind of a factor there too, depending on who you ask. But the standard British or received pronunciation or Queen's English or BBC English is partly a media creation or partly a sociocultural creation. But in most cases, a dialect is a regional. You have Southern US, you have kind of Midland, you have Appalachian English, and so on. A dialect is one variety, usually a regional variety. What is the standard? It's just that one dialect got elevated or promoted to official status. With American English, it's media English, mass media English. In other languages, it depends on the political or cultural center. With Korean, Seoul dialect is kind of the basis of standard Korean, because Seoul is the political, cultural, economic center of the country. With Chinese, Beijing is kind of the basis of standard Chinese or Mandarin or Putonghua or 国语, because Beijing is the cultural, political, economic center of the country. And in many cases, the standard form of language is simply based on what the dialect is of the political, cultural, economic center. In other cases, this may be a synthetic variety, like with English. So defining a language itself is tricky. It's partly mutual intelligibility, but it's also political, social, cultural identity too. So it's really complicated. Now, what is language? Language in general, like human language. How do you define it? Is human language the same as animal communication? Is human language the same as computer language? Not really. And linguists have ways of describing human language and how it's different from other kinds of communication. Computer language is kind of a symbol communication. It's kind of functional in that a computer does something based on instructions from a script. Animal communication is quite different from human language. So let's talk about how they're different. Characteristics of human language. Human language has meaning or semanticity. So if I say, for example, bottle, it communicates something. Most of us probably have a shared idea of what a bottle is. There may be individual differences, some cultural differences in terms of what you normally think of as a bottle or water bottle, for example. It can depend on the context. Red communicates something. It might vary a little bit from person to person in their background or context, but it communicates something. And I can say hope, peace, love, those all communicate something. It can vary somewhat according to context, but there's a shared meaning across all usages of the word red, for example. But it consists of arbitrary signs. Red, R-E-D, R-E-D. It's an arbitrary string of words and letters on a page. And this can extend to expressions. The book is red, a red book. It's just that English has agreed upon this set of sounds, red, to mean a particular color. And particular kinds of structures, like a red book. The book is red, the book is on the table. The red book is on the table. Prepositions go before their nouns, for example, and we use things like the or with nouns oftentimes. It's just that English has agreed on a certain set of ways of expressing these ideas, which are expressed very differently with different words, different sounds in different languages. The book is red, das Buch ist rot in German, and so on. In English, we've decided on a certain arbitrary set of symbols and grammatical structures for expressing these ideas. So somewhat arbitrary, and these are discrete units. You can break a word into discrete sounds like R-E-D, R-E-D, and the phrases can be broken into discrete elements. A noun phrase consisting of the and an adjective and a noun, like the red book, which goes into a verb phrase like I bought a red book, with I as a subject and bought as a verb. The arrangement varies according to the language. It's somewhat arbitrary, but there are these discrete units. Subject, main verb, then a verb phrase which consists of not only the main verb, but subunits like an object, noun phrase, and then noun phrase breaks down into further subunits like an article and an adjective and a noun. It's somewhat arbitrary, can vary across languages. Productivity, we can produce new utterances all the time to express new meanings. A lot of the sentences I've said in this video may be sentences I've not said before. You understand me, pretty much. I can create new expressions at will, an almost infinite variety of expressions and sentences. A native speaker can probably utter an almost infinite variety of sentences and phrases in his or her language. It's productive. We can easily create new ones when we need it. function. Language has certain functions. Communication. I communicate information. I communicate feelings, like how happy I feel. We use it to affect behavior or behavioral changes in someone else. You tell your child, stop picking your nose because you want the child to alter his or her behavior. Or at your house and I say, gee, I'm thirsty, and I affect your behavior because then you offer me a drink. Language not only communicates, but it brings about behavioral responses in others. That is function. Language has different functions. Displacement. We can talk about things out of context. So your dog might tell you this food is good when it's eating right now, but can your dog tell you, oh, I enjoyed last night's dinner? Can your dog tell you that? Or last night's dinner was too salty. Your dog can't tell you about something that's out of context, out of place and out of time. Humans can talk about something that is not contextually present, not physically or present at the time. We can talk about things that happened or even might happen at other times, or things that haven't happened and won't happen. Like I want to be a starship captain. That won't happen, but I can talk about it in English or any language. We can do that with English. We can talk about things that are not present physically or temporally. Animals can't communicate in this kind of varied and complex manner. Computer languages are really notation systems. They are instructions for a computer which lack these characteristics. Now, a couple of other characteristics of language, more abstract. I could take a sentence and I can represent it with a syntactic tree. And this shows something about how the sentence is structured in our minds. It doesn't mean that you think in these syntactic trees, this kind of structure, but this shows that there is a sort of rich structure in language. And this doesn't exist in animal language. This doesn't exist in computer languages. It's a fairly rich, complex structure, like what I kind of explained a minute ago. And you don't need to understand the details of this kind of tree structure or syntactic structure. But what this means is, the key takeaway here is that this kind of structure gives precise indications of where different things go, where the goes, where adjectives go, where nouns go, where objects of verbs go, where subjects of verbs go. And you don't need to understand the theory behind this, but what this means is that we have syntax which gives pretty clear kind of rules and limitations on where things go, the order of words and phrases in a sentence. So there's an order, and if I change the order, I change the meaning. The dog bit the man bit the dog. I change the order in English and it gives you a different meaning. In other languages, you can change the order in different ways to get different meanings. So to express a certain meaning, I say things in a certain way. There's a certain sequence, but the sequence is not just flat like A, B, C, D, E. It's got this kind of complex hierarchical structure. It's a sort of an abstract structure that we have in human language. And this sets human language apart from computer languages or animal communication. This fairly rich, an abstract structure, because you're not consciously aware of this. It's an abstract structure in language that clearly defines the order and sequences of words and phrases in order to communicate a particular idea. It's what we call linear sequence. And it works by using this sort of hierarchical structure. And there's evidence from language processing that this kind of stuff actually is a thing in our minds, although there are arguments about exactly how it works. But there is pretty clear evidence from psychology that something like this structures our language. Let's talk about some common beliefs about language. There's some beliefs that people have that make us linguists kind of cringe. Grammar. What is grammar? Do you think of grammar as a set of rules, a bunch of rules that you have to learn and memorize? But bunch of rules and exceptions maybe, and that there are correct rules for correct usage of a language, and you have to follow those rules. And there's one correct way to say things, and if you don't, that's wrong, or you're dumb. We linguists don't think so. The sad thing is most of you learned grammar in a way that was very mechanical, rule-based. A sort of do this, don't do that kind of set of rules. But then there are exceptions like, okay, don't do that, but on Tuesday, yeah, it's okay. Not really. First of all, let's talk about grammar, because linguists like me, we love grammar, which might sound surprising to you, but as a linguist, the way I understand grammar is very different from the way other people understand grammar. The average person hates grammar because they were taught grammar in such an awful way. We linguists love grammar, but our understanding what grammar is very different. So let's first talk about the grammar you were taught probably is what we call prescriptive. That is, somebody prescribes a certain way to say things. This is a rule for how you should say things in proper English, for example. Somebody prescribes or tells you you have to say it like this. Prescriptive grammar. Let's look at but we linguists, we prefer to describe grammar. This is how native speakers talk or write in the language, and we're not going to judge you for how you say things. So let's look at some of those traditional grammar rules, so-called prescriptive rules. One, for example, is do not end a sentence with a preposition. Where do you come from? Or from where do you come? Most speakers would find the second one unnatural, even overly formal, pretentious. Few people talk like that anymore. Most people today, in any variety of English, would say, where do you come from? It's normal to end sentences with prepositions. In many cases, it's unavoidable, especially with relative clauses. This is the bed where Lincoln slept, or this is the bed that Lincoln slept in. You can't avoid it. In some cases, it's not even a preposition, actually. Turn on the radio, turn the radio on. It's not actually a preposition, it's something else, which we'll talk about later. Another rule, do not split infinitives. Like the Star Trek motto, to boldly go where no one has gone before. To go boldly would sound strange. And we know that English speakers have been splitting their infinitives for centuries. Where did this rule come from? Well, it comes from some English grammarians who had studied Latin. Centuries ago, it was common for educated people to know Latin. And in Latin, infinitive is a single word. Like to go in Latin is ire. But to impose that rule upon English doesn't make any sense. To go, 2 words. And the to is a special function word to make an infinitive. It doesn't make any sense to insist on enforcing a Latin grammar rule upon English. Another rule is don't use double negatives, like don't say I don't have nothing. The thing is, it's perfectly understandable and clear to any English speaker. It is common in most any colloquial variety of English and in most any dialect of English. Another rule, don't use ain't. Ain't, in case you don't know, is a negative form of be, not be. I ain't, you ain't, she ain't, we ain't, they ain't. It's very flexible. It is common in many dialects of English, such as British English and American English and African American English. So I ain't got nothing. That's perfectly understandable. These double negatives and ain't are commonly used in pop and rock and hip hop songs. They're perfectly understandable to us. They communicate meaning to us. It's a normal part of the grammar of most dialects and many colloquial varieties of English. So it's actually a slightly different grammar. Use one grammar for speaking informal colloquial English. Use another grammar for speaking formal English. You might use different grammars if you switch between different dialects. Those are all different grammars. And you can't say that one is necessarily better than the other, it's just that one is maybe more formal than the other. So people who insist on prescriptive grammar rules, they're not really linguists. Linguists would not do that. We don't believe in that. People who insist excessively on a lot of prescriptive rules and like to correct other people. It's what we call grammar Nazis, and linguists don't like grammar Nazis, prescriptivists. All varieties of linguistics, different fields of linguistics and different theories and viewpoints were all descriptive. We believe in describing the language and the rules and patterns of our grammar as native speakers use it, whether it's informal, formal, dialect, or whatever. We believe in describing and analyzing the principles and patterns and rules of languages as native speakers use them. So what is grammar? Grammar is a set of rules or principles that describe how people talk, how people use a language, and what a person could possibly say in the language, and what would be understood in the language. Let's play with the idea of grammar and kind of stretch our notions of what grammar is. Look at these sentences. Are these grammatical? The table is under the book. It's grammatical, it's just strange. You wouldn't say it unless you're drunk. Korea screen ideas sleep furiously. Is it grammatical? Well, yes, but does it make sense? No. This is a famous sentence that Chomsky used to show grammaticality is not the same as necessarily making sense. A lot of things could be grammatical and not make sense. Grammar is just what's possible in the rule system. 3. The rat that the cat caught died. A little confusing, but it's possible. The relative clause is embedded in the center of the sentence, what we call relative center embedding. Take it a layer further. 4. The rat that the cat that the dog chased caught died. It's hard to think of a formal rule that would explain why that's wrong. It's kind of ungrammatical, mainly because we can't process it. It's too complex to mentally process. It stretches our memory capacities. Number 5, the horse raced past the bar and fell. Is it grammatical? Well, kind of. It does in the context if you realize that it means that the horse that was raced past the barn fell. So grammaticality depends on context. More examples. I will pick up the package at 8 o'clock. At 8 o'clock I will pick up the package. These all sound fine. Package up, pick at o'clock will I, 8 I. Doesn't make sense at all. It's not possible to say that in English. I will pick the package up at 8 o'clock. It's not really grammatical. We wouldn't really say that. It's something that maybe a person learning English as a second language might say, but it's not really within the grammar or rules of English. Next examples, I have a cup of pebbles, I have a cup of gravel. Okay. I have a cup of pebble? No, it sounds funny. Pebble is a countable thing. I have a couple of gravels? No, because gravel is a material. Native speakers just wouldn't say that. It's not really possible to say that in English, and to try to say these things is nonsensical. It doesn't communicate. So what are rules? Where do they come from? Rules are not prescriptive edicts from on high that tell people how they should talk or write, not linguistic rules. They come from the language itself. It's the part of the native speaker's knowledge that they have in their heads. It's oftentimes knowledge that they maybe cannot articulate consciously. Just as Freud talked about how we have a whole emotional world that's unconscious, subconscious, and we can't articulate it or consciously know what's going on in there. Well, with grammar, there's pretty much the same thing. There are a lot of principles that structure our language and tell us what to say, but we can't really explain what they are consciously. We have to do linguistic research to find out. Ask a native English speaker, why do you use the on that noun, or a, or an, instead of the? And a lot of native speakers couldn't really tell you. They would say, that's just the way it is, that's the way we do it. And if you change that word, it might change the meaning, or it might not make sense. A lot of the rules are subconscious, or they work subconsciously. They can change. They can vary from one dialect to another, from formal to colloquial varieties of the language, and they can vary over time. some of the rules that you were taught might be old-fashioned rules, and we'll see some examples in a future lecture. Descriptively, there are plenty of rules we can talk about. We know that adjectives and nouns are ordered in a certain way in English, and that articles like the or determiners like all are ordered in a certain way. Determiner, adjective, noun, and it's different in other languages. We use the S to indicate plural nouns. We use ED to indicate past tense. Those are descriptive rules. We put subjects before verbs and objects after verbs in English. Subject, verb, object is an English order. A lot of languages use that order. A lot of languages like Korean and Japanese use the other order. Subject, object, verb. Most languages in the world use one of those two. There are a few other configurations that are also used in a few languages too. But those are rules or patterns of the language. They are principles, they're patterns, they're structures of the language, and they describe what a native speaker could possibly say in the language. A native speaker couldn't utter some of the gibberish, nonsensical sentences we saw earlier. It's not grammatical. It's not possible within the rule set of that language, within the principles of that language. Those are what rules are. They're principles that describe what's possible, what native speakers can say and understand in the language. So grammar is a set of regular systematic rules or rule-like, rule-based components. And in linguistics, that includes syntax, the sentence grammar, word order and sentence structure, their morphology, that's grammatical endings and how words are formed, and phonology, or the sound system, the sound structure of the language. Rules are descriptive, not prescriptive. They are principles, they are patterns, and to many linguists, patterns that convey meaning. These can vary by dialect, formality, level, and even over time. So, we've talked about what a language is. We've talked about what language is, and grammar, and rules. So, next we are ready to start getting closer to answering the question of what linguistics is. In order to do that, we are going to need to talk about some of the key ideas in the history of linguistics, key ideas and theories that define what linguistics is about. And we'll get into that in the next lecture. Just finally, what's the value of all this? Study of linguistics. It's a gateway to understanding human cognition, human psychology, mental processing of not only language but concepts in the mind and brain. It's important for language learning and teaching, foreign languages. It's important for speech therapy, for translation, if you want software that can do a good job of translating languages. It's for AI and machine learning and machine-human interface. For example, if you want Amazon Alexa to understand what you're saying to it, even though you're speaking in Scottish English, or you're speaking in English with a Chinese accent, you want machines to understand you, because more and more we're relying on machines. We need to be able to talk to machines and have machines understand us. And there's actually a lot of good jobs and careers in that. So those are a few examples of the value of linguistics. So next time we will talk more about the history of the field of linguistics and how that defines what the field is about.